You probably have a game in your life that you love for its art style. Even seeing one out-of-context frame feels like it holds between its pixels all the nostalgia and joy of the first time you played it. And if you see another piece of art that has a similar style, you'll probably recognize that immediately. But why? What is an art style actually made of? What are these visual elements that our brain can latch onto and recognize before we even process the image itself? And what rules would we need to make to create a style of our own? As a game dev learner, an art novice, and a perpetual overanalyzer, this question always feels really slippery to me. So this video is part of an ongoing quest of mine to create a system to analyze and even create new art styles. After a whole lot of practice and thought and research and talking to friends, I've come up with 9 key elements that I think make up an art style. Let's go through them, and then you can tell me how I did. I'm Dryden Thomas, and I'm developing Lighthoof, a melancholy Metroidvania focused on zippy combat and tight platforming, where you play as Lighthoof Noah, our skull-masked, deer-footed hero, and his floating light arrow as he explores the secrets of a world strangled by deadly fog. If that sounds cool to you, please pause the video right now and go to Steam and give it a wish list. It's the best way to help out the game right now, and it's free 99. Okay, let's dive in. The first of the 9 key elements is process. These days, most games use either 3D modeling or digital drawing and painting to create the art for their game. This makes a lot of sense since games are a digital medium. But there are radical approaches at either end of the spectrum too. The most elaborate one I've seen recently is Scarlet Deer Inn, where the developers animate characters by embroidering every single frame. Another beautiful game I've been following is called Unleaving, where the developers hand paint every piece of art and then scan it into the game. Then there's the other extreme as well, where every asset is created by the computer, like in Thomas's Alone. Those visuals are made almost entirely with rectangles, triangles, circles, and lighting effects generated within the engine. In all of these cases, the tools used to make the art have a huge impact on how the art looks in the end. The next element is perspective. Perspective is a massive topic. When I was first drafting this section, even when I was trying to speed through it with minimal examples, it timed out at about 7 minutes. So I might have to make another video about that someday. Perspective is interesting because some of it comes from the game's camera, and some of it comes from the art itself. Cameras have 2 main modes, which is perspective and orthographic. In a perspective camera, things that are closer appear bigger, and things that are further away appear smaller. This creates a realistic illusion of depth because it's how your eyes work. This can be seen in games like Skyrim, or Fall Guys, or every single first-person shooter. But we don't always want realism. Orthographic cameras flatten everything out, which can be great for seeing the entire grid in a tactics game, or for cool isometric perspectives like the ones we see in Tunic or Hades. When you're working with 2D though, things get really interesting. You can use all the techniques that artists have been developing for centuries to create an illusion of perspective without relying on the camera. For example, with all 2D assets, you can create the illusion of an isometric camera view, like in the game Unpacking. This is really labor intensive though, because every time that you want to rotate an object, you have to draw a separate sprite for that rotation. This will also multiply the work of creating animations. You can also cheat perspectives with 2D sprites. Look how Stardew Valley shows you more of the fronts of characters and buildings in a way that a camera couldn't. Side-scrollers also do a version of this. Look at the difference between Celeste and Blasphemous. In Blasphemous, you can see the top of the ground and the side of the wall, but Celeste takes a completely head-on view. Both decisions serve the needs of the game, though. Blasphemous looks a little more realistic because of the perspective, which gives those surreal, impossible elements in the game more emotional weight. Celeste's head-on view gives the best clarity about the edges of platforms, walls, and hazards, which is critical for a precision platformer. Number 3 is resolution. With resolution in 2D, you're considering the size of the screen that the game will be played on. High-definition games still aim for 1080p or 4K, but there's tons of different reasons why a developer might aim for a lower resolution. You might do it for nostalgia, simplicity, aesthetics, or even just the challenge of creating within tight parameters. Using different canvas resolutions to create pixel art assets will almost naturally change the style that you draw them in. Take a look at these 4 apples, for example. One of these isn't necessarily better or worse than another, and I'd go so far as to say they all have their own charm. In 3D world, the idea of resolution could be translated into the poly count of the models that are used, or 3D pixels known as voxels. Next up is maybe everyone's favorite, color. Restraining your color palette can have a huge impact on the way that your game reads and feels. The most extreme version of this is monochromaticism. Some games, like Limbo, go all the way to black and white. But break down the word monochromatic into its roots. Mono means one, and chroma means color. As long as you don't rotate the color wheel, you can adjust the brightness or saturation of colors, and it will still be called monochromatic. You can also choose to stay within certain ranges of color in your style. Games with a more realistic or gritty vibe tend to go for more desaturated colors, but stylized games blast you with maximum saturation. Even on the same console, look at the difference between a frame from Super Mario 64 and a frame from GoldenEye, and think about how much that communicates. The fifth element, proportions, is all about how far away you go from representing real-life shapes. The potential for creativity here is truly infinite. On one end of the spectrum, you have attempted realism, where people basically look and move like people. Take one step away and you have some subtler stylizations. Overwatch's characters look pretty much human, but then you see little details like how big Tracer's eyes are. Japanese animation also has tons of interesting takes on stylization. You've got some characters that have elegant, elongated frames, and then you've also got adorable, squashed and rounded chibis with tiny bodies and huge heads. And sometimes you can even stylize a feature so hard that it provokes existential questions like, what's going on with Yugi's hair? Then there's maximum stylization. The crewmates in Among Us are, canonically, not human, but they have just enough human-like features that we can project our humanity onto them and empathize with them, and then we can project their image everywhere else. And that's just characters. Something as simple as a tree can communicate a lot with its proportions. You might create a chunky, rounded tree, or a tall, skeletal tree, or even a mysteriously swirly, gothic tree. The shapes you make when pushing proportions say a lot too, but I think that's a topic for another video. Number 6 is light and shadow. There are so many approaches here that I couldn't even begin to cover them all. But let's start with 2D. The simplest style here would be flat, with no shading. The next level might be adding a flat, darker area of shadow that follows the unlit parts of the forms. You can get more detailed within that by adding other levels of shadow and blending them. Same goes for light. We can also add specular highlights to shiny materials, and if we want to get really painterly, we can blend it all together. You can also add shading with techniques like hatching, cross-hatching, stippling, or halftone dots. Some 2D games even go so far as to use normal maps, which lay over the sprites and tell the computer which direction the surface is facing, so they can have it respond to light dynamically. In 3D though, the options expand way more. Shading is generally handled by the shaders and the rendering pipeline, which can be programmed all kinds of ways to give the game a unique look, from the photorealism of Red Dead Redemption to the pastel toon look of Breath of the Wild. One of the coolest examples I've seen recently is in Hi-Fi Rush, where shadows have this halftone texture layered over them, just like in comic books. That segues really nicely into number 7, texture. We have to decide how much detail we're going to add to surfaces in the game, and this decision should be roughly consistent. I can think of a few different approaches to this in 2D. Like with lighting, the first and simplest answer is none. This is what a lot of Western cartoons use. It might give the game a flat, vector art looking approach as well, especially if it's used without outlines. On the other end is realistic rendering, which is really only ever attempted in 3D games. And then you've got everything in between. Going back to step 1, process can play a huge role here too. Watercolor reveals the texture of the paper underneath it, and has areas of dark and light where the water unevenly distributes the pigment. This texture, combined with inky outlines, is enough to create a beautiful stylized look for a game, like in Child of Light. And you wouldn't have to stop there. Pencil shading, charcoal, crayon, or collage could all give the game a really unique look too. Number 8 is line. Using big, heavy lines is amazing for creating a sense of clarity and fun. Thin lines, like in Grease, can give a lot of style and elegance and allow for more detail. After all, thick lines can't get very close to each other without getting messy. No lines at all might give a painterly or a vector art style depending on the texture. Lines can also have a texture of their own. The World Ends With You uses thick outlines that often taper into spiky points to give this bold, edgy look that it just looks so cool, you guys. Lines are allowed to have color, too. Sometimes lines can be a darker version of the color they're outlining for a softer look. The board game Root has this distinctive look where outlines that would be struck by a light source are drawn in a sharp white. Interesting. And the final element of a game's art style is post-processing. Sometimes this is the bit that can really pull it all together. Maybe it's a little bloom to make those lightest bits glow. Maybe it's just some color correction to make it all feel a bit more muted or a bit more loud. Maybe it's that cinematic blur on distant objects or a film grain effect. Post-processing is an effect that is put on a camera or cameras that changes the look of the objects that are rendered by that camera. And some games, like A Short Hike, use post-processing to completely transform the look of a game. By taking low-poly 3D models and passing them through a pixel filter, a brand new art style was born. Take a look at Lighthoof with and without post-processing. You'll see that without the blur, the background is as sharp as the rest of the art. Without bloom, the light feels a lot more stagnant, and the bright VFX don't pop out of the texture as much. Alright, let's review our elements. 1. Process. 2. Perspective. 3. Resolution. 4. Color. 5. Proportions. 6. Light and shadow. 7. Texture. 8. Line. And 9. Post-processing. Let's use this framework to pick apart the art rules of a game with really good art direction. I think we can all agree that Hollow Knight fits the bill, and if you can't, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. First, process holds a huge sway over the Hollow Knight look. Everything in the game is drawn or painted by hand with few computer graphics other than the black text boxes and text, and very little digital manipulation of sprites within the engine that I can see. The exception seems to be the way foliage bends around you as you move. Perspective. Hollow Knight uses a perspective camera to achieve its depth in background and foreground, but everything is drawn head-on as if it's rendered by an orthographic camera. You never see the floors or the walls. There's a little cheat out here too. The characters and enemies are drawn as if they're turned a little toward the camera despite moving completely perpendicular to it. Resolution, pretty simple. It's all in HD, there's no pixel art mixed in. Color. I've seen a lot of people call Hollow Knight's art style desaturated, and I see why they say that, but I kinda disagree. Each area has distinct and limited color palette, but the colors that are there are pretty saturated and rich, even in areas you wouldn't expect. If I color pick a scene from Dirtmouth and watch the saturation value, it hangs out above 50%. This makes areas that are very desaturated feel much more so. Color picking in the Ancient Basin, for example, rarely gets a saturation value above 20%. In my opinion, it's the heavy use of black and other low values in the composition that makes things dark and moody. Proportions. This style pushes proportions in two contrasting ways. The first way emphasizes roundness. Anytime they can design with circles and curved lines, they do. Big heads and big eyes give a cute look to friendly characters like our hero and Cornifer. On the other end, they like spindly and ornate designs to convey a sense of elegance and detail, or a sense of threat. Hornet's design merges both effortlessly. Light and shadow. Light is usually treated like there's one light source in the upper center of each room. The environment pieces have highlights that are close to the light and get darker as they move further away. Environment pieces are treated with a painterly blending of light, but characters are flat or minimally shaded for pieces that need animation. Immobile pieces like shells might have this unblended gloss, though. There's also sometimes an interesting gradient effect that I can't quite pin down. Texture. Here's another place where the environment and the character layer are treated really differently. Characters don't have any texture because that would make them way harder to animate. The environment has quite a bit though, from the grain on the thorns to the dents and bumps on stone. Still, it's not super photorealistic and it's not trying to be. Occasionally you'll see the texture of a brush even peek in. Line. Another area that varies quite a bit. Characters have thick, relatively uniform black lines, except when dealing with translucent materials like crystal, glass, or infection, where they'll take on some color. The environment sometimes has outlines, but sometimes not. It seems like there are similar rules in place here where glass and crystal don't get outlines, but there are a lot of instances where opaque objects don't get them either. Maybe you're just not meant to think about it this much and just enjoy the beauty. Post-processing. Hollow Knight makes generous use of the depth of field blur for background and foreground objects. There's also a nice amount of bloom on every layer to give the bright areas a soft glow. In this video, I've talked a lot about the what and the how of art styles, but it's getting a little too long to discuss the why. In part 2, I'm going to talk about 3 reasons why you might make one style decision over another, so subscribe so you don't miss that. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.